Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, Discover Arctic Trails as we follow Arctic Tales. Presented by NatHab Expedition Leader, Kristina Disney. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Over to you, Kristina.
Thank you, Rob, and happy holidays to you and everyone listening out there today. I know I'm currently in Victoria, BC, and we actually managed to have a white Christmas, which for us doesn't happen here very often. So it's been pretty nice having grown up somewhere where there was always snow at Christmas time to get it again. So it's definitely put me in the spirit. And with the winter season upon me, it's been nice to do a bit of a memory throwback to the days when I used to dog sled. So right now, I'm currently in grad school and I've been a guide for Natural Habitat since 2018. But before I worked for Natural Habitat, I used to train dogs in the Yukon. And it was one of the best, most amazing experiences. I actually just the other day or the day before last, I threw this in there. So this is a postcard that I wrote to my aunt in 2017, and she just sent me a picture of this over Christmas. And I just wanted to read you part of this because it worked, you could say serendipitously or whatnot, that to come back in time before doing this webinar with you all. So I think I'm living the dream up here, or I'd say that I'm living the dream. Wait a second, I gotta move your guys' box so I can read the rest of this. Here we go. I'd say I'm living the dream up here, but I don't think I've ever put much thought into what the dream really was. Probably as with anything, it's a series of highs and lows. I've had frostbite on my face and my fingertips and lost the trail in blowing snow and had to find my way home across the lake. Don't tell Dad. But I've also covered thousands of miles training with the dogs, and they're like family. I've seen mine and the team shadow cast twice at the same time, once in twilight and moonlight. It's not always easy, but even when it's bad, it's good, you know? And I had forgotten that I'd even sent that to her. And so her sending that back to me and getting to read it this Christmas was such an amazing thing, because right now life is very, very different for me. There was a time when I lived in a one-room cabin, didn't have any running water, lived more or less right beside the kennel with 50 dogs, and they were my whole life. And now it's still an adventure in a much different way. I have come back and on my way to do my PhD. And funnily enough, I'm still sitting in snow pants. I was just telling Rob before we started that my lab mate left the window open and the snow and the freezing rain came in. So the office is a bit chilly right now. So slightly different scenario. But either way, at least to say, it's a pleasure to be back and thinking about the dogs again. And so I know for most people, and speaking for myself as well as being a little kid, you know, our impression of what dog sledding and mushing is often comes from pop culture. It comes from movies, books, things like that. And, you know, some of those things are really true to life, and some of them are exaggerated and you know, they're there to put a smile on your face. But it's our interest with our four-legged friends as sled dogs goes beyond just our pop culture references, right? They're ingrained into human life and to human history. And when we think about that, you know, there's lots of really big moments all throughout history where this comes back to us. So what the picture that you're looking at here, so this is from 1911. We're actually just over the 110th anniversary of when Amundsen and his crew made it to the South Pole. And they were in competition. So that was the Norwegian expedition. And the British expedition that was led by Robert Falcon Scott, they got there 5 weeks after them, which I feel like would be such a grind to have come so far. I mean, still a success to have made it, but to certainly come so far and only be in second place. And a big difference between those two was the strategies with which they used to get there. So Amundsen's crew arrived December 14th, 1911, and they used dog sled teams. They brought Arctic dogs to the South Pole in order to trek across the sea ice, whereas Scott's team had brought down Shetland ponies from Iceland, also very prone for colder weather, but certainly not as well adapted. And I think that's sort of goes to prove that they fill a really amazing role with humanity and have co-evolved with humanity for their survival. So this is a really cool photo from the early 1900s. It's a picture of an Inuit woman and her pack dog, her sled dog, as they're traveling across the land, right? So when you and I think of huskies or sled dogs, we think about them hitched up to a team, pulling away. But in reality, the breed or the dogs that have been used by the Inuit for so long, they weren't really used to pull sleds until around 800 AD. Before that, they would have been, mostly used for helping them hunt things like caribou, muskox, even seal, things like that. They would have been used, or for polar bear, have the dogs circle the bear so that they could spear it, things like that. And so they've been ingrained with the northern Canadian or northern populations circumpolar, not just across Canada, but Alaska, Russia, Greenland, things like that. These dogs have been a part of that livelihood and that way of life nearly since they crossed the Bering Strait and it's all developed. And so I feel like to understand how we get to the sled dog, you sort of have to backtrack a little bit and think about our current racing dog and the life and the livelihood that came from. So when we talk about Inuit dogs, the Inuit word for it is kimik. So it's got a heavy K sound at the back of your throat at the end, kimik, that deep sound. And these refer to the dogs that were a part of Inuit culture as far as traveling, hunting, things like that. And they're not, it's important to make the distinction that they're not just a result of sporadic breeding with wolf populations and domestic dogs. So, I mean, yes, that did happen, but that you could almost think about that as more of the exception than the rule. That's not how this breed came to be. It really was a more ancient ancestral canine that was early domesticated with the Inuit, and then that population is considered nearly separate from wild populations of wolves. And so we call them, you can either call them the Canadian Inuit dog, the Greenland Inuit dog, and it is its own specific breed. They're very, very bulky. They've got really thick fur. And some people still use these today, although there are certainly less of them than there once was. And this has to do a big part with Canadian history. So the true Inuit dog was actually almost extinct somewhere between the 50s and 60s. And the reason for that is a darker part of Canadian history, but one I think that deserves to be acknowledged so that we know better than to repeat the mistakes of the past. So when the Canadian government was trying to assimilate northern populations into Western culture, part of what they did was they would relocate families from different places. They would try and force the Inuit who were nomadic across the Canadian archipelago and the north, because they would move and hunt with the seasons. They tried to force them onto settlements, get them to be dependent on them. And so one of the ways that they would force them to give up their nomadic life was they actually killed off most of the dog population, right? If they couldn't have anything to move their sleds, then they were forced to stay. And if they were forced to stay, they were forced to be integrated into that culture. And so it, thankfully, these dogs weren't wiped out. In the 70s and 80s, there was a group of people who created a dog recovery project. And they essentially went around to these few surviving villages that had one or two dogs here or there, and they asked them if they could take them with them. And they started a breeding pool. And what went down from, most likely less than a couple hundred dogs is or even I think it was less than that. I think it was closer to 50 of what was left of this really truly astounding breed was wiped away. And so they started rebuilding it in the 70s and 80s. And it's interesting because it hasn't fully recovered in the sense of that there's really just a few pockets of these dogs left. And that reflects a few things. One is change in livelihood of the people, right? Like these dogs thrived alongside humans because they shared a livelihood, whereas now some people still do use them for hunting, trapping, things like that, but mostly it's for recreation, right? It's not like you need to have the dog team set up and ready to go so you can go and hunt and feed your family. Now people jump on a snowmobile, a ATV in the summertime, right? We've mechanized it. So they'll never go back to likely being that same strength and relationship between humans and these Inuit dogs as there was before. But that being said, their uniqueness and their pure perfect adaptation, I almost want to say, which is maybe a bit too far to say, but I'm a bit biased, to living in the north, right? They'll hopefully never truly disappear as they fit into that niche so well. And just a note, I think, is that so in 2019, the Canadian government did officially apologize for the practices that were placed on the Inuit. So they apologized for killing off the sled dogs, for relocating families, for forced separations, things like that. So hopefully working on the reconciliation towards that. And just a quick aside on the cultural reference of this, because I feel like maybe you guys are telling this story in the future or learning, sharing something that you learned from this talk, or who knows when this comes up. But I think it's important to make the effort to learn how to share the information correctly. So Inuit stands for, it's the Inuit word for, it's the Inuktitut word for people. So you wouldn't say the Inuit people, because it would be saying like the people's people. And it's the same as, so that would be the sort of grammatically correct way to speak about them. And then also just, I feel like we've sort of gone past this, but it was a recent thing that came up in Canada a while ago, so I thought it worth bringing up again, the difference between Inuit and Eskimo. So there are some populations in Greenland and places like that who do prefer to be called Eskimo. Most of the Inuit in Canada and as well as Alaska find it a derogatory term and prefer not to be called that. And in the sense, it's the same way of thinking about as, you have a rival sports team in the next town over, and maybe your team is the, I don't know, Buffalo or something like that, and they start calling you the Cows or whatever. Like the point is that it's what someone else would call you, it's not what you would call yourself, right? So that's the reason why we've moved away from that and have gone with their preferred term of Inuit. And another cool thing aside, so for me, having been a child born in the 90s, there's things that you take for granted as having always been a certain way, but a lot of Canada's Inuit population is in Nunavut, which is actually Canada's youngest territory. It's only been self-governing since 1999. So really the life of these dogs, and they're the emblem of the territory, right? It's that history is still a living current history, and the way that people's lives changing it's still happening to this day, and the effects of that. So I feel like we've talked about, I kind of plunged us straight away into the history of dog sledding and how it used to be more than just a sport than what it is in today's world. And I'd now like to sort of step away from the history of it and actually look at the huskies themselves and how it is that they're so amazingly evolved to not just, survive in Arctic, subarctic conditions, but actually thrive. And one of those first places that I think that makes sense to talk about is some of the traits that they share with another canine friend, which is the Arctic fox. So if you're going to be a mammal living in the Arctic or the subarctic, there's some commonalities that they tend to share in their physiology because it's the most efficient way to survive in that environment. So first thing, if you look at our cute little friend here and you look at their tail, really big fluffy tail, right? And it's almost like carrying around your own mattress. You'll see the dogs, just like this fox here, when they curl up, they'll curl up and they'll get their tail underneath as much of their body as they can, because that's that space between them and the snow. So it's that extra layer of insulation. So that's a pretty common thing to see if you're a dog living up north, they'll evolve for that. Also really small ears, right? So you're thinking about that surface area. So if you compare that to a desert species, something like a rabbit living in the desert, they often have really huge, big, long ears, and you can see the blood vessels, and that's because they're trying to dispel heat, right? That circulates through. Whereas if you're living up north, you're trying to conserve as much heat as possible, and if you just have really big ears, the more likely they're going to get frozen off. And so that would be selected for over time to have smaller ears to make that trade-off. Another cool thing is the countercurrent heat exchange in a lot of their paws. So what I mean by that is that so the blood flowing in and out of their extremities often is paralleled right beside each other. So that means that as it reaches your wrist or things like that, the blood coming in would be warmed by the blood going out, so that your heart doesn't have quite as much of a shock, and that also it conserves energy. So the adaptations go on and on. And the fur themselves, right? So lots of species often have the undercoat and then the guard hairs, right? And it's this huge insulation factor that is the reason why they're able to survive up there. So going back to thinking about that Arctic fox, normally when you live in a colder environment, you need to have a larger body mass in order for it to be efficient enough to survive, right? If you're little, it's harder to keep yourself warm based on surface area to volume, whereas if you're a larger creature, like a bear, like polar bears, right, you're able to conserve heat more efficiently. So the trade-off is that Arctic foxes are very, very small, but they're able to, because they have such a dense undercoat of that fur, they actually have extremely efficient heat, and so their fur keeps them warm, even when it seems quite unlikely that their little bodies would make it. Oops. So a cool thing about them, I remember I did a study on them, I think when I was still an undergrad on this. So they can survive Arctic foxes can survive in extremely, extremely cold temperatures. And I remember I was doing a study on their heart rate, and I was looking at these old papers, and they'd done this study in Alaska on a bunch of different species. They're trying to find what temperature was their lower critical temperature. So what that means for you and I is, what temperature do you shiver at, right? It's when does your body have to start actively producing energy to stay warm? So like me right now, I'm actually really cold because this room is so cold. So my body is, the air temperature is such that my body has to devote energy to keeping me warm right now. And so for humans, you and I, we're actually pretty sad. We have to start actively, I guess to clarify, so when we metabolize things, the offset of that is heat. When we move, the offset of that is heat. So usually our body moving and doing things enough, if we're in a warmer climate, you don't have to set aside extra energy to create heat. But when you're in a cold environment, you do. And so they took all these animals and they had this big walk-in freezer. I think they did it in Fairbanks, or maybe it was Juneau in Alaska, I can't remember which. But they got one of these big walk-in freezers, and they would put all these animals in there, and they would crank down the temperature to see what temperature they would start to shiver at. So I remember they put in I think they put in like a lemming, one of those little tiny Arctic rodents, and they started to shiver around like -15, -20. They put in a Hereford cow. So that's, for anyone who knows cows, that's the breed, that's the red, and they have the white and the horns. And they didn't start to shiver. These temperatures are in Celsius, so -20. What would that be in Fahrenheit? I'm usually better at remembering the conversions. I think closer to, so 32 is 0, so probably like maybe 10s in Fahrenheit, I'm not quite sure. And then they put in bison, and that didn't start to shiver until -30 Celsius. Right, so we're getting almost closer par for par. as our -40s are both the same in Celsius and in Fahrenheit. Anyways, long story short, they go to put in the Arctic fox and they crank down and the fox still isn't shivering. They crank it down to -50 Celsius, still isn't shivering. They cranked it to -60 and they couldn't get the fox to shiver. It still was just perfectly content. It was curled up, hadn't produced extra energy to start to stay warm. And so what they actually had to do was they had to ship a fox to Seattle where they had one of those cryo freezers. And it took until, in zero wind environment, it took until over -100 Celsius for the fox to actually have to shiver. That's how amazing well adapted these little creatures are to surviving up north. So they certainly have my respect. But back to our dogs. Sorry, it was worth the aside. So back to huskies, and this is something that's true for the Arctic fox as well. So when you look at their feet, right, you can see which breeds tend to be more adapted for a colder climate. When you pick it up and look at their paws, you can see that hair between the toes as that excellent extra insulation factor. And so a cool thing when you're racing, so if you look at this dog here on the left, they've got those neon booties on. And so when you're racing a dog, right, in the wild, the dog would run for however far, and then if it needed to, if it got ice stuck in between the, right, because the ice will build up on the edges of that. It keeps their in between toes, but the ice can build up. And so you don't want that. It's the same as like having a rock in your shoe as a person, right? When you're walking, it's pretty uncomfortable. And so we'll often, for really long distance teams or races, you'll often put booties on your dogs. And so that keeps the ice from forming underneath. And so if you're going to do that, it means you have to cut their toenails, which was probably the hardest thing I had to learn to do, which is sort of, I think, funny to say. Out of all the things I learned dog sledding, the hardest one to learn was cutting a dog's toes. And it's because they can be very, very finicky, and you have this tiny little thing, and you're trying to hold this dog still that's like moving around a whole bunch. So I would say if you were to actually ask me what was the hardest thing I had to learn, it was probably that, which is funny. But yeah, so we used to go through hundreds of these booties, right? Every single dog, you have a 10, 12 dog team. Maybe each got 4, and sometimes they'd fall off, and you have to switch them out. And so we'd often play a game when we were racing that when you'd see a dog had dropped a booty, you'd try and bend down and like swoop and grab it on the way by without stopping. It's sort of like our own version of jousting, maybe. And oh yes, so we've talked about some physical adaptations. There's also behavioral adaptations when we think about sled dogs, right? So very similar to their wolf cousins, there's a very, very strong hierarchy in a kennel. And it comes to that because everyone has a role and a place, and it's not, it was interesting spending so much time with them because when you and I look at this photo, right, and especially that dog lying down, right, there's a lot of aggression, and we would associate that with human emotions like anger. But when you see them interact with one another, I definitely learned a lot because it wasn't, the role of the alpha and submission and things like that. There was never any animosity behind it. When I would watch them, a dog fight would break out, and you'd try and break it up as quickly as possible because they'd go at it, but as soon as it was over, they'd go back to splitting a bone with someone with their kennel mate, or they would, as soon as that one dog submitted, excuse me, and then the alpha's like place was reassured, back up and away they went, right? But that pack mentality is how they're able to survive, right? A single dog would never be able to take down the prey that it would need to survive, whereas all of them together take care of one another. So it still exists there. Now, my favorite adaptation I saved for last because I know it might not sound super exciting from the get-go, but how their metabolism works is so, so cool. And it's worth the time I'm going to spend on this, I promise. So you and I, when we're thirsty, we often go, have a glass of water, cup of tea, right? We're consuming water that way. But really, in reality, there's 3 ways when your body needs to hydrate that we get that water. So the first, there's either free choice water, preformed water, or metabolically acquired water. So for you and I, right, we turn on the tap, we get a drink. If you are a sled dog, right, there's very little when you're racing of turning on a tap and getting a drink, right? You might drink from a stream that you cross. When we're racing, handlers, mushers like that, you're mixing water into their food, but it's a frozen world out there, so it's not super accessible. And especially if they're drinking from a stream or things like that, it's cold, so their body has to heat it up. And so there's energy consequences to that. And so really the way that they actually get, if you're a dog, the way that you get most of your water is actually preformed water. So in a race or any sled dog or most northern predators, right, your preformed water is the water that you're getting from the food that you're eating, right? So think about if you were to dehydrate your vegetables, or when you're making beef jerky or something like that, right? The water is being extracted from there. And so about 80% of the water that they're getting is from that water. And so when you're feeding a dog sled team, for example, what you'll often do is they usually get fed, they get 2 meals, we'll say, per day. There's usually an early in the morning meal, and it'll be, but then the rest of the day is snacks, right? There's always little snacks coming in. And so that's getting the water from that meat that they're eating, those beaver treats or whatever it is. That's what they're using to break down. Now, the other 20% of what they're getting is metabolically derived water. Now, I fully confess, I have a biology major and a geography major, and I still don't really do microbiology. So don't overstress about the picture. I barely survived genetics and micro. So the important thing that you need to see from here is that when you and I, when we have sugars, carbs, things like that, and we break them down, right? So when we're looking at that equation at the top, when we break down those carbohydrates, the byproduct of that is often CO2, water, and then the energy molecules that our body needs to use for whatever process is happening, right? So the CO2 we breathe out when we exhale, and also that water we're breathing out. But some animals are better at retaining that water and utilizing it than others, right? So for humans, you and I, we don't retain very, very much. Excuse me. But if you're a sled dog, when you're breaking down fats and things like that, they're extremely, extremely efficient at grabbing that fat and putting it back in, when that fat gets broken down, that water stays in their system and hydrates them. So just to give an idea, right? So you and I, the nutrition facts always say, you need about 2,000 calories in a day. If you're a racing sled dog, you're eating somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 calories in a day. 60% of that is usually fat, right? They really have a super high fat diet, and they're able to break that down. If you and I were to eat that much fat, I mean, you can go into ketosis or ketosis or things like that, but we're not, our metabolism isn't designed to thrive off of that. Whereas these rich, high in fat diets is exactly what makes these dogs able to perform so well, right? They take that energy, break it down, and they're just this really, really efficient metabolic machine. Now, I feel like some of you might be asking, well, what about snow, right? Aren't they eating snow in the wintertime? And the answer is yes. I'm not going to say that they're not, but if you look at how much water their body is using versus how much snow that they're eating, you'll see that that's not really where it's coming from. And it makes sense in a few different ways. So one, think about the volume of water in snow, right? So depending on whether it's a warm day, fresh snow, and it's really moist, but most of the time, you're looking at less than 20%, sometimes 5% of the actual volume of snow being water. So to get how much liquid they would need, they'd have to eat buckets upon buckets of snow just to get a couple liters of water they'd need for that day, right? So there's the inefficiency of the amount they'd have to consume, and then there's the inefficiency of the weight, right? So it takes about 80 calories to raise a degree of water, right, when it's frozen, to try and start melting that. Whereas like once it hits zero, then it's much more easier. But so when it's still frozen, it requires way more of your body's energy to convert that to a liquid to consume than it is even if you're just going to drink cold water in a puddle, right? That's way easier for your body to heat up. So it's not super efficient in a place where there's not a lot of calories to go around if you're not racing, right? Whereas if you're racing, you're being fed those calories, but you don't want the dog to have to spend the energy it takes on heating up that water in its body. You want to give it a nice warm meal, sort of like a soup, right? They get a little bit of liquid and they basically eat their water that way, right? They're just consuming as quickly as they can. It's really sloppy gruel, usually is what we gave them. And so it's not, oh yeah, and then the third reason, which is I think less about the dog and then more about the sport, well, it is about the dog, is that, if you have all of these dogs running in a team and a couple dogs keep always bouncing their head down to try and grab a bite of snow, you don't want them to get hurt, right? If they're trying to grab a bite of snow, they're not paying attention where their feet are going, you don't want them to sprain a wrist, things like that. So dogs are really efficient at this, right? I was saying that they're getting about 20% of their water metabolically. But I kind of want to put the spotlight on one of the grandiose creatures who's the best at this. So polar bears, essentially, their life is all about fat, right? And there's a really great quote that I love from a researcher at UC Berkeley, Elaine Lorenzen, and she says that for polar bears, profound obesity is a benign state, which I think sums them up so well, right? A beautiful, healthy bear is such a fat bear that their belly is dragging on the ground and they look like a big tube, right? That's what we hope to see. And that's because polar bears' whole bodies have evolved, to survive on these fat-rich diets and derive everything that they need energy-wise from that, right? So their genetics even have selected to be able to process, what you and I call bad cholesterol. They have this one gene called ApoB, right? And essentially, it's able to utilize that cholesterol in a way that our bodies can't. And so, when I was talking about that fat diet, right? So if you're a polar bear, all of your water is coming more or less metabolically, right? Because they're eating, their main diet, right, is seals, a few other things, but so they're eating the blubber off that seals and the protein, and that's the only thing, right? They're on the sea ice the majority of their life. Some bears never even come to land, and so, right, they're not drinking salt water. Their bodies aren't. It's not like they're excreting the salt or anything like that. They're actually going months without drinking, and so they're that high fat content that I was talking about. And when I was saying that metabolic process, they're able to get most of their water from that fat that they're eating. And it's amazing because they can even do that while they're nursing, right? They're so efficient at it that they can create enough water when they metabolize fat to keep themselves hydrated and to keep their cubs hydrated. And so their body is all about, transferring fat and surviving off of it and the storage of it, right? So if you're a cub and you're nursing from your mom, that fat is much higher milk content, fat content than like humans or cows or anything like that. Like when they're really little cubs, you're getting close to nearly 50% content. By the time they're about 2 and they're nearly ready to wean, it gets lower down to maybe 5 or 10. But for most of their life, it's in around 30%, or most of their weaning, or most of the time when they're nursing, it's around 30%. And so when we think about that, right, like the whole thing about polar bears is to consume as much as possible, convert the blubber that they're eating into fat on their own body, which they then carry around with them as their walking energy store until they get their next meal and they replenish it. And so the fat reserves in sled dogs, right, they're not worrying about their next meal necessarily in the same way. And so their body, in the same way, or they're the opposite, sorry, I should say. They are all about being a fast, efficient metabolic machine where they're turning over energy really quickly and using that metabolic water really quickly, whereas polar bears are all about that long-term storage of fat in their body and keeping those reserves high. And so I'll often say that you'll never truly see a fat sled dog, right? Their 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 metabolism is so high, and that's where that comes from, that they keep those calories burning through. And it makes sense because they're so active, right? They're legitimately running 100 miles a day, sometimes for weeks on end, right? And their bodies are not breaking down. It's not like, when this stops, they completely fall apart. Like a well-trained, healthy sled dog can run 1,000-mile race, take a couple days off, get up and do it. Well, a couple days, maybe an exaggeration, but right, where it's not as if you're pushing them to this point where you're breaking them. Their bodies are completely designed for this extreme amount of effort, which I think is probably the most mind-blowing part about it. And so there's a lot of interest in understanding how they're able to do that, right? What about their bodies allow that to happen? And so there was a study done, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 years ago. And so what they did was they actually took small little match-sized stick pieces of muscle from the dog's legs throughout a 1,000-mile race, and they took it every 100 miles to see what was happening, right? They were looking at what was the levels of protein, enzymes, glycogen found within the muscle tissue as the race progressed. And so thinking about that, right? So what they were trying to understand was the curve of when they were using up the energy in their muscles. So think about glycogen, right, as it's the carb, but think about it as the fuel. And so we have fuel in our muscle cells, we have fuel in our blood cells, we have fuel in our fat, right? And so our body, depending on, when we start exercising, when you think about you and I, or the dogs, whichever, when we start exercising, we burn through that fuel, that glycogen in our muscle cells first. And now for you and I, when we burn through that reserve, we get tired, we get muscle fatigue. Now, what they learned about the dogs was that when after a few days of those 100-mile races, about day 2 or 3, once those internal fuel inside the muscle cells was depleted, then they switched their metabolism. So instead of focusing on glycogen in their cells, they started focusing, the metabolism switched and was drawing the fat from their blood into the cells, which is something we can't do, right? Our metabolism doesn't work that way, but that's why they're able to have this really, really intense high fat diet and make all those conversions, because their body's capable of pulling it in, which is super duper cool. And so when part of the reason they can do that is because they have more mitochondria in their cells than a lot of other animals do. So think about it as, part of that is when that fat comes in, they're able to break it down into energy really quickly because there's more generators, there's more engines to use it. The other reason is because our bodies, our cells aren't very good at pulling fat into the cell, right? We can pull glycogen in, right? Think about it as like a packaging thing. Only certain size of packages fit through our cell walls. But if you're a sled dog, the way that their insulin in their body, so that hormone insulin, is able to change their cell wall so they can actually get that fat in. And so there's a whole bunch of studies on sled dogs trying to see how that can affect diabetes for people, the effects of obesity, and then also the other side of that, training athletes and how humans can train for endurance and have the right cycle to promote that sort of relationship. So we've talked, the history of dog sleds. We've talked about the evolution and the adaptations of the dogs themselves. So now I thought I would kind of give everyone an idea of how a team works in and of itself. So when we're racing, we usually have our front two. Sometimes you'll have a single, but usually you have your front two lead, and then your two dogs behind your lead are called your swing. Arguably, these are your brains of the operation. You want a smart dog who's tuned in and listening to you, right? Because everything we do is by verbal command, right? We're saying G and ha for our left and our right, which are words that traditionally come from like Teamsters, people who used to drive horses and things like that. Those words came with English as mushers moved north and got into the sport. And so there's a lot of trust between you as the musher at the back of the sled and your dog team at the front, because if they, if they just take everyone on a left turn because they see a rabbit in the woods, you're all going to follow, and a huge wreck can happen because of it. So usually when we're training them, so this is a young team here, and essentially what you're seeing here in this photo is that for every pair, there's an old dog paired with one of the yearlings. Right, to sort of give that consistency, that help them get into the flow and the habit. Some of my favorites are actually in this picture, but I won't focus on them too much. I miss them quite a bit. And then the second dog behind those are your swing dogs. So the idea being that your lead dogs are the ones that are making decisions, but usually, depending on the age and strength of your team, you'll also have either maybe some older, more mature, experienced dogs, or alternate lead dogs in swing, because they help the whole team move, right? So if you have a short team, if you're only running with 6 or 8 dogs, having a strong swing maybe isn't so important because the leader only has to guide a short team. But sometimes if you're running 12, even 16, you want to have a really strong 4-pack at the front, because their body movement, right, that direction is going to what's drive everyone else when they make those corners. So very, very important. The other ones that have a special job are our wheel dogs. So those are the 2 closest to the sled. Oftentimes you'll see some big burly dogs at the back, but not necessarily. But the reason why that is because these dogs have to deal with the shifting weight of the sled, right? Everyone else, it sort of fades away as you go further up the line, and they know the sled is there, but the wheel dogs at the back, they're the ones that are going to feel when you, because it's kind of like skiing in a lot of ways, right? You're on those runner sleds and you shift your weight, you're going ups and bumps and downs. And so you need dogs that are very adaptive, actually quite quick on their feet, right? As they make those moves and adapt their weight with it. And of course, then there's the team dogs in between. And I do not, just because they don't have a special name, this should not at all by any means degrade their value, right? These are the ones that you trust to take you home through and through, right? They're there, the thick and the thin. My boss used to say that the best dog in the team was the one that you would forget was there. And the reason why that is because if they, never had a problem, never get tired, they're always happy to be there, and you just kind of, you don't ever have to give them any special treatment. It's the best dog that you have. And so far, if we're looking at the picture on the left, I just wanted to mention this as well, right? So that's a traditional trail setup for your dogs, and that's what most racing happens now with that line, right? Because you're going through trees. But if you were to look at a traditional setup for huskies, crossing, sea ice or anywhere up north where once you're beyond that tree line, they would have actually a fan pattern. And the reason for that is because you'd want to distribute the weight, right? Some of that ice that you're going across isn't necessarily super stable. And so you want to spread out that weight as much as possible in order to track that, right? And also because there's no trees, you don't have to worry about running into things. And so you would still have a lead dog. That dog would have the longest line in the center, and they would be pulling ahead. Again, you need a really strong temperament dog, right, to encourage that team forward. And then moving out in the fan shape, everyone would have a slightly shorter line moving to the left and right. So each of those dogs, the general setup is that you have the pull line, right? And that's attached to just above their tail usually. And then you have also another line connected near the collar. And so there's no tension on the collar line, right? All of the weight, because they're pulling, should be coming from the back. And that collar line is mostly just to sort of keep everybody nice and orderly, but you can tell some of the dogs get nervous and they like to chew on them. So before you've even taken off, they've chewed through their collar line and they're running around being silly, not paying attention. But also that lead line, that center line on most teams today, or most people who race, it's actually got a wire center to it, right? Because the dogs do tend to chew from time to time, or if they get bored, you really want to make sure that that's not breaking it at any cost. So this is another shot of my Well, actually, no, this isn't the yearlings. This is like the B team. So when we used to race, my boss, Jerry, he would race the A team, right? So all the first string dogs, I'll be in his team, and we'd be in the races together. And he was pushing to win, and I would get to go in the race with the B team. And the goal of driving the B team was never necessarily to win. The goal was that the dogs would have fun, that they'd build stamina, right? Because the B team would be a mix of sort of the older dogs who'd been around the block but weren't necessarily willing. They weren't going to push it as hard as they used to in their younger days, and the younger dogs who were just sort of getting into it, and they needed to build up that confidence, right? So I loved it because I got to do these amazing races, and we still did well in quite a few of them, right? But my goal was always just the dogs having a good time and building up their confidence. So that was a pretty great job to have. And so finally, right, we're moving down the line, getting closer to myself, the musher. So if you look at the structure of the sled at the very front, if you look at that picture on the left, right, you've got where the line comes in, you've got that bow at the top, and you really do need that thing called the brush bow, because when you don't want to get hooked on anything, you want everything to slide past you. It's like the bumper on your car. Right, you're gonna fill your sled with all your gear, your dog food. Depending on the race, sometimes you have to be completely self-sufficient. So those sleds can weigh a couple 100 pounds before the person even gets on, right? Because you've got all the dog food they need for a couple of days. You've got your own sleeping gear. You've got some hay for them to sleep on, right? You've got your fuel for starting a fire, heating up their food for them, right? So when we would stop and feed them, what you'd usually do is you'd have your own. You'd start a fire, and then you'd start melting snow. So when you did give them something to hydrate with, right, you're giving them warm water. You want it to be a good meal for them. And then if you look at those photos on the right side, so that's sort of when you see, so you can see there's something there called the brake, the snow hook, and I think they call it, what do they call it? The track or the pad or something like that? Yeah, they call it a track. So you could think about that as your snow hook is your parking brake. Your brake is when you hammer on the brakes, and then your track is when you are, just sort of need to slow everybody down, and you don't want to come to a full stop. You just want to drop it down a gear. So the snow hook is much like an anchor on a ship, right? You are, when you plunge that into the snow, it actually digs itself down. So you want to put that in while the dogs are still moving, and then it'll dig into the snow. And so often when we decide whether the weather is good enough or whether there's enough snow to dog sled, it's never about is there enough snow to go, because really you only need a skiff of snow for those runners to slide over. It's about, is there enough snow for that hook to dig into? Because if you can't safely stop a team, you can't safely drive a team. Then that brake is like two hooks as well. So that's for stopping and slowing down. And then that track pad is usually got some grit to it to keep you moving. So I can remember early on when I started racing was the first thing I was told was that never let go. Short of me, I was told by my boss when I first started, unless I was going to die or break a leg, I was not to let go of that dog team, because they will keep going if you are not on that sled. They don't really care whether you're there or not. They're so stoked and they are so jacked and excited that they will just run. And sometimes when we were doing river races, if you look in that picture on the right, they'd have, if they get away from you, they will go for miles and miles, and they'll get hyped and they'll get excited, and there'll be open leads, right? So if they get too close to the water, and that whole team goes in, right? So it's not just your safety and the fear of being left out in the middle of the wilderness that you keep a good hand on that. And there were times, I'm not gonna lie, where I I would take a corner too sharp, the sled would tip over, and I would be getting dragged and getting hit by trees. You can actually sort of see the traces of the scar there just under my right eye. There's a little bit of a dark patch. And that was from taking a branch to the face while being dragged on the ground. I remember one time, it was in February, and it had warmed up enough, maybe it was March, it had warmed up enough that the ice on the lake, the snow had all melted, and the ice had melted and refroze, and it was really, really slippery. and there was absolutely zero traction. It was my first time on glare ice on a sled, and I didn't know how to deal with it, and so I didn't keep enough tension, and the sled had it, so the dogs are running straight and there was no friction on the sled, and the sled started sliding out to the right, and I was starting to like be parallel with my own dogs, and then the sled like tipped over when I tried to recover, and the dogs saw, and there was zero friction, right? So the less friction there is, the easier it is for the dogs to run. The dogs were super excited because everything was easier all of a sudden, and they just drug me. And I remember, I mean, it's ice, so it's smooth, but there's all the cracks and bubbles, and I came back that day, and I remember I had just bruises all down the side of my body. But I never lost the team, so that was the important part. Bruises aside, frostbite aside, I didn't lose the team. And yeah, there was some touch and go ones. This was from a race out of Dawson. I remember coming back in -30 the whole time, and yeah, it was that was a cold one for sure. You know, I talked about all the adaptations that the dogs have. For us as humans, right, when we're racing, um, we're keep. This is me when I hit the finish line, and when I was running, all that I had was my eyes open here, right, and because everything else is covered. Whenever you see movies and people are up north and they don't have their ears covered, completely untrue. It would freeze off right away. Right? And then, you know, some of the adaptations that we had these big insulated water bottles we used to have with us, and they had a straw on them. You'd have like a latex straw, because you couldn't actually, right, you're wearing these big gloves and you couldn't handle anything fine. So you'd have this big straw, and you'd take a drink, and you'd always have like hot boiling water in there, drop it off, and then you drink, and then you'd have to blow the black through the straw, because if it ever froze, it meant that you weren't going to be able to drink until the next time you stopped at a checkpoint. So there was a few tricks of the trade we picked up along the way. I am just about out of time, but I'll make this a quick story because I'm almost at the end here. Let's see if I can play this. So my what you're seeing here is a video from, I think this was the 3rd or 4th race I ever did, but it was at the same location that was the first time I was ever on a dog sled, which was a 100-mile race. You could say that my boss at the time very much believed in trial by fire. Up until that point, I'd been on a dog sled twice, and he's like, well, you're either going to figure it out or you're going to fall on your face. So I hope you figure it out. And I was so scared. I wasn't scared to do it. I was scared something would mess up. I don't know. But I was excited too. And so and he told me, like, up until then, I'd only ever been on wide trails, you know, the 2 times before. And then there was a lot of curves and S's on this track we were going on, or on the field we were going to, or trail. And I remember, like, out of the gate, you know, it's different time release. I remember going, and the first corner, I like biffed it, smoked into the thing. The dogs are yelping, excited, thinking that I'm stopping for a break, and they're all jacked and excited. And I just, like, I don't know how many times I fell the first little bit, but by about an hour into it, I was much better with dogs musher than I had been before. And yeah, my boss eventually caught up to me, and he laughed and kept going. And so there wasn't any time for super amount of mistakes, but I got it figured out pretty quick on the 3rd time. And then a few hours in, I remember, so in a 100-mile race, they usually break up the segments where you've got, there's always a mandatory rest period in most races. So you can stop and rest anytime you want with your own team, but there's always one after a certain distance or certain time that you're required to rest your dogs. And so a 100-mile race is usually about 24 hours. And so from beginning to end. And I remember by the time I'd gone through the first half of it, we'd slept overnight with the dogs outside, and the next day I was going back, and I was feeling pretty good. The dogs and I were doing good. Everyone was healthy, happy. I'd learned how to do corners and feeling pretty good. And I missed. So there's markers, right, to tell you, because there's lots of tracks and trails out there, and so if you hit the wrong one, you're kind of in trouble. And I had this really stubborn lead dog named Red Bull, and he was convinced that we should be going ha, not a G, so we should be going left and not right. And he took me and the team down this little side trail, which I wasn't supposed to be on. And at this point in the race, I was actually doing good. I was in about second or third. And oh my God, if you think that trying to parallel park or you know, trying to do a U-turn with a car on a little road is narrow or tricky, trying to do a U-turn with a dog sled team remains probably the most adrenaline-filled thing I've ever done. Because what you have to do, right? So, and I guess I didn't explain this earlier enough too, but so as soon as there's no pressure on the sled, the dogs want to run. You know, you are there as a brake. You are not there as an encouragement to go forward. They are super happy to take off and go. And so with that, it means that you never want to be behind your team, right? If you step away from your sled and walk behind it, and for some reason that snow hook comes out, the dogs will take off and you're not going to catch up to them. You're not going to outrun a dog sled team. So you always, if you're going to walk, you always want to walk ahead of your dog so that if something happens, you can grab the sled and everything's okay. So in order to do a U-turn, I had to hook my snow hook into a tree, run to the front of the line, grab the front dog, and then on this little tiny trail, loop the dog back around, and then without getting the 12 of them tangled up, and then let go of the dog. And then as the dog started running, my sled came loose, which was the plan, and then grab the sled as it went whipping by me, and then get us to go back up the hill and go back the right way. And then I remember my heart was just like freaking out because I didn't, you know, I remember in the back of my head, don't lose a team, don't lose a team, never let go, never let go. And here I was pulling a U-turn with a dog sled team. So it was wild anyways. And I dropped a bunch of places. I think I came in sixth because of those little antics, and my boss sort of laughed at me, but he was proud. And it was actually just before Christmas in 2017. And I ended up having from that race there wasn't any time after the race because I think we'd forgotten what day it was or who knows, but I got from that race on a plane, flew home to see my family without changing my clothes. And my family said that I smelled like smoked salmon and a garbage dump because I had smelled like the dogs I'd been living with and all that. So it was a wild adventure anyways, to say the least. But oh, okay, I'm over for some time. Thank you for listening. It's been a pleasure to get to reminisce about some of the dog sledding adventures of the past. And I love every year when I go guiding in Churchill that I get a little taste of it again, and spend some time with the mushers up there when we dog sled with the guests on the polar bear trip. So it's been an absolute pleasure. Happy holidays if you have to run off before you go, and I will pass it back to Rob.
Thank you, Kristina. Now, before we start the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in the control panel. Okay, we do have time for a couple of questions, so let's get to it. So how fast can a team of dogs run?
Ooh, okay. So if you're going to train a team for like long distance, like when you're talking about people who do the Iditarod, the ideal speed to have a team run at is about 9 miles, maximum 10 an hour. A dog can keep that pace literally for 10 hours, contently, not overstressed. If you're talking about mushers who do sprint racing, you know, in which case the dogs aren't running long term, they're maybe only running for half a day or a few hours, and it's all about speed. It's pretty exhilarating. You can be ripping like 25, you know, going downhill 30 miles an hour on a dog team, which is quite the adrenaline rush.
Wow, that's fast. So how old are the dogs when they're able to compete in races? Are they trained a lot as pups?
Yeah, that will change depending on the kennel and the people, right? Like everyone's somewhat different. In general, most racing dogs that a dog usually doesn't start racing until they're about 2. They're in their prime, like that's just when they're started. They're probably in their prime from 3.5 to about 6 or 7. Those are really good years. Lots of those dogs that you saw seeing there, like some of the old boys I would work with, you know, those are like 13, 14-year-old dogs. As long as they're happy and healthy, they won't, I mean, those dogs don't do, you know, they're not going and doing things like the Iditarod anymore, but they'll happily do the training trips and things like that. The first time they'll get harnessed is the first time you'll like put a dog on a harness is anywhere from 6 months to a year old. And the point is for them to just wear it, do a little wander around, like do a little mile, come back and be like, whew, that was good. Like you just very early start getting them comfortable with the idea.
Interesting. Now, how do you evaluate where a dog would fit best in the team?
Yeah. Part of it has to do, so some dogs you can see are very insecure when you put them at the front. Dogs that dogs that tend to have sort of an alpha personality off the line, in the kennel, things like that, those ones that will most likely want to be at the front anyways. So there's part of that. Wheel dogs, you're sort of looking for ones that have a certain build, maybe things like a bit of a stockier build. The real trick, and again, this also comes down to everyone's preferences, but in reality, it's good to try, like you let all of them try a lead dog spot when they're around 2, and you see who has having a fun time, and you see who's like, oh my gosh, this is too much for me. And then after that, you sort of keep training them in those roles. But I mean, lots of dogs, like a few of the ones that I worked with, they were 5 or 6 before they ever went into lead, right? Like it's very much based on personality. I'd say they're quite like people that way.
Of course. So since the population of the Inuit dogs was reduced to so few, are there any genetic problems reestablishing the breed?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. It's not the same. I mean, in genetic principles, yes, because there are so few of them. But an interesting thing about them is that they're, what's the right way to say this? It's not like Cocker Spaniels or Bulldogs or Poodles, right? Where like Cocker Spaniels have bad hips stereotypically, or that the Lassie sheepdog, right, always has nose breathing problems because we've bred them for these certain traits. Because they almost have a wider genetic pool to start with, because there's no specific trait that's been fixated on. There is still some of those issues with smaller breeding pools, and you do have to worry about that, but there's there's a healthier amount of genetic material to work with, because it hasn't, right? Like it's like there is a group that we call the official Canadian Inuit dog, which is what I'm talking about with the subgen, that genetic issue, and you just keep track of that. But one thing I like when I say the word husky, a cool thing about that is that a husky doesn't mean it's a specific dog breed. It's because there isn't pedigrees in huskies the way that there is with other breeds. You can mix and match. People have brought in racing dogs like greyhounds and thrown some of that in. Every now and then a wolf gets into a kennel, and that, like, there's so much genetic diversity that we don't have those problems with those genetic things that we think about as much. So I'm sure if it dwindled more and more, it would only get worse, but it's I think it's been better breeding practices, you could say.
So are all the sled dogs these days, are they all the Inuit, or are there other
No,
dogs?
actually, most sled dogs now are a mix and match of anything you could. They're the ultimate mutts. They're a little of everything. There are still a few people, and I really do mean like a handful of people who run Inuit dogs. Mostly, there's a few in Nunavut. There's a population of them in Churchill, actually, that still exists there. There's only a few hundred, so people don't run them. The other reason why is because they are more suited towards hunting and trapping than they are towards racing. So these dogs, like their top speed comfortably, they're only going to go at maybe 6-8 miles an hour max. They're more of like a workhorse. If you were to think about them, they're like the Clydesdale of it, right? They're all about moving heavy loads over not so long distances. And there's old stories of them. And they're also extremely aggressive. This is actually probably the biggest reason why most people, like, when you see someone with a husky as a pet, you're like, oh, that's nice, it must be very active, and people don't really have these dogs, like the Inuit dogs, as pets, because they're extremely aggressive and they're very territorial and protective. When you're racing, and if you meet another team going down the line, sometimes you might get a few snaps back and forth, but well-trained dog teams will just pass one another no problemos. If you try and pass one of these dogs, they take it as a personal offense and they will go for the throat. So like in old stories, like you would like see another dog team coming, like drop your hook, run to the front of the line, tackle your own lead dog so that he didn't drive the other team into, like drive them into the other team. So you don't see them in races very much. They're mostly just in villages and where people still hunt and trap.
Well, let me ask you one final question. What adventures do you lead for NatHab that include the opportunity to experience dog sledding?
Yeah. So you can, if you're coming along with us, it's kind of I get really excited about it, although it's only a one afternoon event, but you go dog sledding on almost all of the Churchill trips. I think there's only, I think the only one that you don't go is if you stay on the Tundra Lodge, but any of the other trips in Churchill, we do our very, very best to make sure everyone gets a chance. You don't have to go for you know, a 100-mile race. They usually go for a mile or so. So you get a little taste. You get to spend some time with the dogs in the kennel. And one of my really good friends, Wyatt, he's him and his dad run the kennel that we work with up there. So really fantastic dogs, fantastic people. It's a fun part of the trip.
It does sound like amazing fun. But unfortunately, that's the last question that we have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you, Kristina, for any closing comments you might have for us.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in on your holiday season. It's feel very lucky to have some of your time. If you are on vacation or spending time with your family, I hope you enjoyed this, and take care. Hope you stay warm or happy and healthy wherever you might be. It's been an absolute pleasure. Until the next webinar, take care.
Thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today, Kristina. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.